Hello everyone, very new video today. We arrived at a point in the channel in which we can acknowledge which videos are going to change it forever, provided that, as you know, many additions have rather sort of enriched the channel than overshadowing any element of the same. On the contrary, they allowed them to spark with brighter light. I would like at the same time to get into this. So the first video on hermetics, literally with a random topic out of the blue. This is something that very deeply entwines with what we have already discussed with our videos, especially about history of religion, of tradition, and that is fundamentally, in fact, just an integration of that, if you want. Actually, it's very difficult at this point, you would say, to sort of explain further what Schwerpunkt is about, but I think that the bigger this becomes and the more we're going to articulate the stuff, showing that it's not simply a temporary fashion or something that, I came across randomly, but that I have been really gotten into, and thoroughly so, the more this channel is going to acquire some sort of broader universal relevance for anyone who has, of course, the patience, the time to listen, to sort of to see what this is. As I've always said on Schwerpunkt, in spite of all the mysterious ideology that people still, in a strikingly unsuccessful and confused way, keep wondering without actually listening to any of my content for real. I am here mostly for expounding tradition. I call tradition, now I will not even digress on what we mean by tradition, because we have neither even had properly that talk, at least in a formal, thematic, specific sense, however you understand roughly what it is. That's something I've discussed also in some other some interviews, for example, like why do you do what you do, what is that you're trying to say, etc. And I must say that every person that at least stopped listening to it for a while got completely sort of surprised by my intent, and I am can't say I'm satisfied with it entirely, because of course I could always do things better, but I receive also a lot of messages, comments, some very touching, also recently, for example, in the last Q&A video, saying like, Schwerpunkt, I don't get everything you say, but this is something very important. Your channel has become a point of reference, has become, at least, I wouldn't like you to to quote unquote just follow me. I would like you to realize that there is something within you that is worth pursuing, just the way I do for myself, and that I decide just to put online for anyone to sort of get the gist of at the same time. Today we talk about the Triadic structure. There are many ways you could call this. We will, of course, as a first video on this universal topic, like we will have to skip some also foundational definitions. I will try to give you some basic information that can make up for it. But this is, as I was saying at the beginning, just something we'll keep building on in the future. You could even talk about this as the Trinity, all right? We've seen this also in the European tripartite order. A further proof, by the way, contrarily to what people skeptically try to deny at all costs, I think mostly for ideologistic reasons, permeates the entire traditional background, right? So something like the Trinity is not some mere invention. It's not something like that appears here and there. You can sort of cite those two sources and say, well, or at least what you think this would be, because it's not even a couple, and it ends there. And then if something is not explicitated at some point in history, there's no trace of that, or the entire system does not actually know this, and so there is no way you can talk about the soul, the spirit, and the body, right? That would literally be the Father, the Holy Ghost, and the Son, right? This is, of course, interchangeable to the degree you can achieve unity through this description that is in fact referred, as also in Christianity, as a consequence of the fall. Christ's accomplishment brings to a divine transfiguration of the world that is true in eternity. We'll not digress on how or why humans are still mortal. There is actually a very important point to that, that is to say, to make them partake divine glory through their own deeds, through their own works, which, of course, if you deny the value of, it's going to be a bit difficult to even attempt, right, to achieve. There is a deep metaphysical, other than just theological concept. Hermeticism, I would like to call it hermetics, because any ism doesn't quite sound right, not even traditionalism or universalism. There is something called properly tradition, or the universe. These are concepts that can be better outlined if we learn to especially look at their etymologies, rather than some sort of ideologistic, in fact, approach to them, especially if you have no idea what they actually say, for you to instead claim some criticism of them. Now, prior to advancing any further, it's essential to dwell upon the parallels within human nature for the principles that have been derived already from many videos that we have looked at, and that refer to the aforementioned Trinity. Right? If you really look at Indo-European religion, you will find it relentlessly, ceaselessly. It's all there, right? And it's not doom and zeal. It's not what people think, because people tend to cite, but don't really look at the thing, right? They look at it through the filter of other people. And instead, if you don't really spend a gloriously long amount of time looking at the very sources, it's a bit difficult to even sense what it's about. It's something I mostly learned through my military historical work. In fact, I'm correcting a peer-reviewed paper that I submitted to. By the way, you will come to read me, I must say, regarding topics that I realize, if you're not aware of, may seem confusing at first, and or sort of you may not see in the way others that have been into may, right? And a great part of the burden there lays not much in the, in quote unquote evidence, or facts, or whatever. The evidence is good, of course, but there are many ways to interpret it. But the way, in fact, you expound this, the way you sort of project this in all the possible dimensions that allow the person from any corner, from any perspective, to actually get it, right, from their own. That's what I'm doing in essence. Now, in line with the axiom, quote, everything that the macrocosm has, man also possesses. We've seen it really as actually the very foundational principle of Indo-European theology. I have a video incoming properly on the sound K in the European phonetics that expresses the whole thing, and it's amazing, really amazing, and will come up, I don't know whether next week or the following one, I don't remember. But given that all is contained within man, sulphur, mercury, and souls constitute the so-called trimundium, right? So the three, also dominion, possession, but identity at the same time, right? And wealth, in that sense, resource, within the universe, and likewise exist within man, where these three worlds, dimensions, if you want, appear as soul, spirit, and body. If you're interested, if you can't find, even years ago, some of my work, I often refer to the doctrine of the afterlife and the tripartite soul and what happens. It's exactly the same thing. If you are still in the post-Halloween mood, you can check that out if you haven't done it already, and compare it with what we're going to say now. Bear in mind also the differences here: soul, spirit, and body. In the aforementioned video, we have seen how there is essentially a most important soul, which is the one that actually goes under judgment and can win, if victorious, through the Mars Triumphalis, in fact, a place in the firmament, or basically die out, right? The spirit, which is more like the persona, right? And so what we see in life with a living organism, and what appears mostly in this becoming, right, other than, and becoming that can't go both ways. This is what I mean. And the body that is instead is the soma, and returns in any case to the netherworld, to the inferi, if you want, because it's part of the totemic clan of the ancestors. If connected with a soul transfigured in the firmament, can keep, in fact, providing with life, etc., and power, and so on. So we've seen this all in that video. Now, it's crucial, however, to clarify right away that the words soul and spirit do not retain their contemporary connotations in this context. There are, in fact, different ways even of calling them. In Hermetics, yes, this would be the proper terminology. I will be citing some source later if you're interested in the actual passages. And here in particular, but this is very important from a conceptual starting point, the soul represents the genuinely supernatural component of the individual personality. In other words, it's a projection of divinity through the form that the being has, right? Just other than merely substance, right? And so it is transcendental, as a matter of fact. It's truly divinely sparking. Conversely, the spirit, one may confuse the two terms. So also ghost, as a matter of fact, refers to the complete set of psycho-vital energies that form an intermediary realm between the corporeal and the incorporeal, serving as, quote-unquote, the life itself and the vitalizing force of the organism. Now, within the Holy Trinity, to connect this already, like the soul with the Father, but especially the Spirit with the Holy Ghost, is of striking relevance for all a number of reasons. And it is about sacred royalty. We have seen how essentially the leader, right, is struggling in a realm that is said to be distant from both God and man, as he's the medium of divinity. He's doing is sort of, absconditus from especially men, but properly pertains to a dimension of its own. Think about in the Fortuna Caesaris theology how Caesar exits the res publica and literally fixes the system. Also properly in its earthly ecumenic dimension, through in fact divine auspices that are the ones left also to Augustus in his Res Gestae, for example. It explicitly stated that everything that was done, it was not in fact merely out of his own volition, but it was through properly as a medium of God, right? Equally in this sense, the Holy Ghost comes to manifest in this dynamic force in man, because it is truly the vitalizing force itself. It is the grace, theologically, man. It is properly the spirit. In fact, let's be honest, it's not merely the pneuma as such, it's not the soul per se, it's literally the spirit that allows for life to exist, and therefore in a miraculous fashion. The Holy Ghost is the winged glory that you see in the sort of the universal mythology, especially in the European world, in the mid-Iron Age in particular, properly flying ahead of the hero's chariot. The guy is the son, right? And then you have the Son at the top, that is the Father, and in that sense, the absolute soul. The Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit guides, right? Now, this triadic mapping deliberately inverts modern psychological models, interestingly enough. At least, for example, Freud's ego-id superego triad, which is rooted in empirical observation and mechanistic causality, in a, de facto, almost could be easily deterministic, materialistic, zoological, and, in fact, in this sense, properly animal-like fashion, by instead establishing an ontological hierarchy grounded in metaphysical participation rather than functional interaction. This is extremely important because a great deal of our world indulges in empiricism, mechanicism. This is true especially from the Anglosphere historically in the last couple of centuries for different reasons. Like each one has their own ways, but given that the Anglosphere was dominant, remember that there is an overwhelming tendency, also in the aforementioned sort of skepticistic attitude to anything, not just tradition, but anything that in fact sounds remotely ghostly and in the sense quote unquote conservative, whatever it may mean today. All right. Not surprisingly, Freud was sort of much more famous than Jung, at least in psychoanalysis, given that there was probably a Marxist takeover that continues today with the sort of self-indulgence. You are what you are, you shouldn't worry about anything. Yeah, the best way to make a person even more mentally ill, as a matter of fact. Now, in Hermetic anthropology, the soul, sulphur/sun, because this is the symbolism of the soul, is not a psychic faculty, but the immutable, self-luminous divine spark. These are obviously divine attributes. As it's called in Hermeticism as well, the scintilla animae, the spark of the soul, or pneuma aurum, which is probably the breath of the vivifying breath of God, of the sun, right? Ontologically prior, by the way, to all manifestation, and identical in essence with the uncreated light, and so the perennial dimension of God. The spirit, instead, is Mercury/the moon. We'll see, of course, there's a plethora of mythological references to this. I have a video, for example, in Coming on the Olympians, and Artemis, for example, Diana, the moon goddess. You may think, well, she's sort of apparently a chthonic, in fact, symbol, like what it has to do with the Olympians. It is incredibly functional because it has to do with this very rising dimension that is shared, and the connection with Mercury we'll see better also in another video. In the spirit, as such, is not mere emotion, as we're prone to again think our faculties in a way, or even not even intellect per se, but the volatile lunar psychic continuum, right? And as such, the anima mundi, the soul of the world, individualized, comprising imagination, deeply connected with providence in potential, by the way, vital breath, prana, ruach, and the subtle body, the sidereal vehicle, which, as the moon reflecting the sunlight, mediates between incorruptible essence and corruptible form. Besides, do you realize who this is? Traditionally, the church as well. So before you read, for example, some exoteric mysticist who claims, oh no, the church ruined everything, it was just, a great symbol of the chthonic dimension of the great, but cut it out, right? This is not a matter of opinion. This is properly etched into theology from millennia and millennia, and great Ghibelline fan, one can so say here, believe me, and the sun, of course, wouldn't in that sense be achievable, but through the moon in this dimension. This is again incredibly important against any intellectualism and or emotionalism of this world that seems to be really, if you look at today's political commentaries, an end to itself. Literally presuming to have an opinion, feeling, showing yourself agitated, right? Having this sort of eternally perturbed, shocked state. I mean, just like Tucker Carlson's face when he's talking, all shocked in front of people revealing this deep truths, right? Of course, that is also a lie for that matter. That's why it does not belong to tradition with capital T. Now, the body is the last element that can be dignified in this very sense, and that's why you understand in this sense why, for example, the Eucharist in Christianity, but it's something, again, belonging to the broader Catholic ecumenic tradition in previous millennia. The body, salt slash earth, really, is not the organism per se, right? So that the sun obviously is not merely a human thing, as also in fact Christology, but the principle of fixation, right, of crystallization and existential inertia that acts as, still provided with the aforementioned elements of this, as we've seen, the soul. These are three elements corresponding to the wall of the being, right? And so it's rather the degree by which this exists. We are all containing these three elements, right? It's just a degree that tells us towards which we are more oriented. And of course, there is a gradual sort of, not just dimension, but quality to this that differs along the way. The existential inertia, right? The crucifixio spiritus in materia, which is a beautiful Latin phrase for properly the idea of the spirit manifesting in the substance, right, as a form of condemnation, right, of crucifixion. Not much as the Gnostics believe that, in the sense, the body, in the sense, is evil. Incarnation is a fruit of the devil, and so rejecting the flesh. No, right? The Catholic tradition, and again, also before Christianity, explicitly says that, yeah, we are fallen, and so that's bad, right? And our incarnation is a bad thing, but it's not bad in the sense that you must get rid of the flesh, and so therefore destroy yourself completely. That's pure Satanism. It has nothing to do with tradition. It's complete inversion. But that there is no way but to achieve divinity, but through our own flesh. And the spirit, as we've seen, operates in that, and it's also, in this sense, enshrined by the form of the soul, of the divine, that we have to put really at work for ourselves. Hence, receiving the grace through works, the Holy Ghost, the Spirit. You understand how it's all one, it's all intertwined. So the tomb, by the way, salt, earth, that's exactly what it symbolizes. Because just like on Carthage, you throw salt after you are destroyed, because the idea is that from that nothing can spring out. It's just like in Mithras' myth, the fact that Mithras initially was purely a stone, and so in theory from that was the lowest, say, materialization of the world, as opposed to the spirit that, however, is able in Mithraism to become the sun god, right? And this is the Sol Invictus. It's there since ever. It's not even an Eastern thing. It was present, for example, among the Italics way in archaic times, without any sort of connection with the East, if not through the Indo-European matrix, right, of the earlier migration. And so the tomb, right, it's so symbolizing human mortality, of course, wherein the higher principles are entombed during the fall into individuation. In other words, if we exist as individuals, it is because we are selfish to the degree that we cannot attain the plenitude of perennial divinity, right? And so the more we are, the more sinful we are, the more we degrade ourselves into something fractal and inferior and individualistic, right? Now, this inversion is operative, whereas modern psychology begins with the observable and ascends to the hypothetical. Hermetic science begins with the supra-individual and ascends through symbolic correspondence. In other words, it's the difference between believing, respectively, not believing in God and believing in God, right? Using the human composite as the laboratory for cosmic reintegration. With this foundation laid, man carries within the soul, which in the hermetic manner stands for the influence of the solar and golden force. Within the spirit, he harbors the influence of the lunar and mercurial force. By the way, Hermet's Trismegistus tries great in that sense. Remember, is the most explicitly Catholic definition of divine victory and salvation. Well, these three elements at the same time. That's why you're resurrected in the flesh, right? And in fact, in the body, at last, the force of salt finds its expression, that which along the path of fall equates to crucifixion and confinement, yet along the path of resurrection becomes dominant power, burning water, right? Stabilized under a spiritual directive, right? And yet the salt is, in this sense, washed by water in a properly baptistic sense and allows for it to a surge to a higher status is quite relevant. We talked recently about the aqua, the nu, the na, in the European theology, and you see how God is born, is reachieved also in the lower realm of the becoming from the darkest abyss of the waters, right? From the womb, that in this sense is also sanctified, just like the Virgin in Christianity. Now, accordingly, there are some specific Hermetic authors that naturally we were citing here, and we will look at better also as figures. Like one is Bernard Trevisan, 1406-1490. This was a legendary Italian alchemist from a noble Paduan family, northeastern Italy. He also made a video about medieval Padua, if you're interested to see the prestigious university, who began his pursuits at age 14 with family support to amass wealth, collaborating initially with Citeaux monk in France, and who traveled, in fact, extensively across Europe and the Middle East in quest of the famous philosopher's stone, expanding his fortune until his death on Rhodes. Look at the years, by the way. I made a couple of months ago a video about the siege of Rhodes exactly at this point. Now, this author, Trevisan, declares in the Parole de l'Essai, quote, "There is Trinity in a unity and unity in a Trinity." By the way, remember skepticistic attitudes in that sense, was to be an anti-papal sense, it turned out to be also anti-imperial. At the time, probably of the collapse of universalism of tradition, William of Ockham, right? The famous razor applied also to Trinity, like, something that is one cannot be treated as saying, well, if you're not even familiar with the doctrine of being and becoming, well, what is your business talking about tradition or Catholicism, right? Studying that sense, Meister Eckhart, that is definitely more interesting. There is Trinity in a unity and unity in a Trinity, right? This is a few decades, by the way, before the Reformation. And there are body, spirit, and soul. It's very explicit about this. And there, he adds, also Mercury and arsenic. This is naturally pure alchemy, as you understand. Similarly, Jacob Bohm, 1575-1624, was a German Lutheran mystic that, however, and this is actually I wanted to open a parenthesis before, that is to say, when you look at the Protestant Reformation and also some movements that are not even better defined because some members were also anonymous and or operated within a specific political context under some religious currents, but expressed some of these doctrines. Like they're mostly Protestants. Are they? Like we don't clearly know, because also our understanding of Protestantism, especially of the early centuries, aside from sort of the most, of course, radical extremistic currents, and definitely the foundation of Protestantism is wrong as far as that, because there is an attitude also towards these elements, right? What is that you want to achieve? Is it turning to something more material or literally chemical, or is it something metaphorical? It's something that you can apply to a world that many people had already forgotten regarding, in fact, the achievability of these conditions. In any case, Bohm, that was, again, a mystic philosopher and self-taught shoemaker, among other things, from Alzheidenberg near Görlitz, renowned for visionary experiences that blended alchemy, Kabbalah, and Christian theosophy, influencing later romantics and idealists like Hegel and Blake, states, quote, everything that grows, lives, and moves in this world contains sulphur, and Mercury is its life, and salt the corporeal essence of the hunger of Mercury. This is for citations where people say, you don't never cite, you don't use bibliography. Yeah, because I don't make paste and copy, paste and copied AI generated bibliography like basically all channels do to claim that they have read that thing. If you listen to me, I actually cite stuff. The Signatura Rerum 419. This is all, by the way, freely accessible content, right? For people who, by the way, wonder, but how, like this is hidden or something, strangely. It's, clear as daylight, or if you really want to document yourself about the stuff. Now, this, what is interesting again here, aside from the Lutheran background, the same exact concept. This is truly trismegistic and Trinitarian. Now, these specified parallels are readily traceable throughout the relevant texts. One need only maintain awareness of the symbolic equivalences up to this point highlighted, along with additional ones that may be inferred, and remain vigilant in cases where, due to an alternative underlying premise, identical symbols assume a significance that can occasionally invert the primary interpretation. Because if you really look at literally what Marxism did, they took idealism and they flipped it. It's not like they did anything specifically, genial, right? They simply rejected tradition and made all their effort to destroy themselves and the world in the process. There isn't much to call. And the entire point of tradition is that if you accomplish that in that direction, you're going to succeed. If you go the other direction, literally destroy everything along the way. Other famous name, Basil Valentine, 15th century, though likely a pseudonym for 16th century German authors like Johann Tölde, salt manufacturer from Frankenhausen, but this is debatable. We will see it better in other videos about this source. Portrayed also as a Benedictine monk from Erfurt's Priory of St. Peter, celebrated as the quote-unquote father of modern chemistry for his practical chemical knowledge and alchemical treatises blending Paracelsian ideas with metallurgy. Paracelsus, yet another, of course, famous figures just in philosophy in general, for how we study them, because they seem just like broader thinkers, but we never descend into what they actually technically believe. For instance, depicts in one Azov plate a figure of a man carrying the whole universe on his shoulders, thereby disclosing the authentic matter of the work, which, if you allow me, we will not going to sort of discuss today. That has surely to do with the concept of, in fact, the work proper. In another plate bears the same title and incorporates the well-known motto, quote, Visita interiora terrae rectificando invenies occultum lapidem. He plainly assigns the correspondences sun, fire, soul, moon, spiritus, corpus, stone, which is the vitriol acronym, by the way. Literally means visit the interior of the earth. By rectification, you will find the hidden stone. Right? Naturally, if you come from traditional theology, you look at this Renaissance language and you smile at it because it's so already post-tradition, so secularized, right? But it is just for saying, and we will have to open another big parenthesis on that at some point, that this doctrine had historically survived, right? That throughout the entire Middle Ages, so the alleged censorship / repression of the church, this doctrine was pretty much alive. We know it pretty well through many channels, by the way, because one privileged one about which we know relatively few is the military one. It was likely the most important, the Ghibelline imperial tradition, ideology, and so on. Then you find here some third estaters essentially dedicating themselves now to this kind of craft and interpreting it all with sort of a bias of their own kind, right? Now, in the aforementioned work, Sulphur, functioning as soul, is described as the uncomplicated element of the stone, pertaining to the human composite, detached from all forms of corporeal densification, right? This is obvious because it's the sacred fire that has wholly purified any, in fact, bodily impurity, and pertains only to the immutable and superior nature. The De Pharmaco Catholico, which is a 17th century alchemical treatise attributed to Johannes de Mont Snyder, roughly 1625-1670, was a flamboyant Polish alchemist and favored figure at the European courts, known for documented transmutations. Influences, there are also some paintings, including one I inserted here, influences on Isaac Newton, by the way, in writings like Chimica Vanus that integrated Rosicrucian and Paracelsian elements. 316 says, quote, "The philosophers, in speaking of the earth, have meant by it nothing other than the body, and by the body nothing other than salt." Right? Then in 5.1, and this is, again, you can all find it. I use the archive.org version from the original manuscripts of the quote, "It," and here we're talking Mercury, "pervades and penetrates as spirit both the other principles." This is the Holy Ghost, all right, bridging, like literally the pontifex did, like creating probably a bridge across this the perennial and the generating nature. Salt and sulfur, right? The other ones, principles that Mercury penetrates, and so that's also why you see Hermes with, wings. By the way, because it's nothing but the Holy Ghost, right? Understand, salt, of course, and sulfur being body and soul, which Mercury unites and constantly binds by means of natural heat. This is also fascinating if you watch that video made on Agni, and how also the videos on the sacred fire and so on, how this manifests in the world with thunder, right? You have an idea of how this literally looked like. The Trionfo Hermeticum, the Hermetic Triumph, an 18th century Italian Hermetic dialogue attributed to Alexandre Lemoyant de Saint-Didier, roughly 1638-1711, was a French alchemist and translator of German esoteric works who synthesized traditional chemical metaphors in a Baroque style, influencing later figures like Fulcanelli through his symbolic expositions. 302 states, quote, "There are three different substances and three principles of all bodies: salt, sulfur, and mercury, which are the spirit, the soul, and the body." Right? This is much easier and repetitive than our videos on ancient sources that naturally need more interpretation, but are also clear as daylight when you understand this actual logic. So you understand already the modern mentality is fixating on these principles just as if, let's bear in mind, we don't have to lose a memory of them. We have to focus chiefly on the fundamentals. This tells you how much humanity had been degenerating historically from the origins already along the way. The same phrasing appears in the Psalter of Hermophilus. This is a pseudo-epigraphic 16th or 17th century alchemical text, possibly drawing from Byzantine or Arabic traditions, with no confirmed author but often linked to Hermetic pseudonyms evoking ancient wisdom, structured as a poetic or liturgical commentary on elemental principles. In Michael Zendivogius, 1566-1636, is a Polish novel. We say Polish, but of course, as you understand from also Snyder, etc., we're talking the Germans who live here, and mostly also the constituting part of the the Polish intelligentsia in that sense as actually the German element from the Ostsiedlung, more elevated from majority of the Slavic peasantry. Physician, diplomat, and pioneering chemist, so slash alchemist, who studied at Krakow, Oxford, and European courts, serving Sigismund III Vasa, by the way, and Emperor Rudolf II. This is literally the peak of sort of the alchemic era. We'll surely make more videos about this. And of great, by the way, as we were mentioning before, also Lutherans, of incredible. This is the age of Baroque, of the sense of lack of center that these studies try to reacquire in a more, in the sense, say, degeneratingly from traditional kind of attitude. You know that at this point the Habsburgic court even sympathized for Calvinism. Right? You have this sort of extreme issues, and so you can't quite immediately sort of place these figures in a straightforward, conventional, spiritual, cultural, and religious category, right? If you don't understand how people really saw the world at the time. Michael Sendivogius, credited with early oxygen isolation, by the way, as quote-unquote cibus vitis, what the life is fed by, and innovations in acids and metals. And in the De Sulphur, a 17th century treatise on sulfur's alchemic role, definitely authored by Michael Sendivogius as part of his Novum Lumen Chemicum Corpus, so the new chemical light, emphasizing chemical purification and cosmic harmony. That in 173 states, quote, the body is the earth, the spirit is the water, the soul is the fire. That is the sulfur of gold, right? Reflect on the nature of the waters, by the way, and the fact that, as we've seen in the European theology, you could not achieve divinity but through the waters, and so therefore through the fight against the darkest forces of the world. If you don't summon those, you can't attain and tame them, right? You can't attain divinity. Nicholas Flamel, that is actually a medieval author, roughly 1330. Roughly was born then and died in 1418. He was a historical French scribe and manuscript dealer from Paris who posthumously mythologized in 17th century legends as a successful alchemist, achieving the Philosopher's Stone and immortality, funded churches with his wife Pernelle, inspiring modern fiction like the same Harry Potter, for example, that I thoroughly despise as a piece of fortunately, I never poisoned myself with any of that trash, nor the movies, nor the books. But, you know, the few things I learned and so were you know, horrified me enough not to, you know, have any regret whatsoever. I'm already very sort of skeptical about Lords of the Rings to begin with. And Tolkien's entire view on Catholic providence in his own sort of insular source or whatever. Like, I will not digress on this, but just for saying that we're not making here a channel on the edge. Oh, you know, this is the hermetic. It's prohibited. No, it's actually just has to be framed in continuity with the original Catholic tradition. And this guy Flamel actually, in the this attributed work, like that is le désir désiré, the wish to wish, right? 6 says the same thing. This particular citation, because we've seen it's all attributed to this medieval author, is from Antoine-Joseph Pernetti, 1716-1796, who was a French Benedictine monk, naturalist, and librarian to Frederick the Great, by the way, who explored the Falklands, delved into Swedenborgian mysticism, and authored hermetic dictionaries and alchemical fables as a key figure in 18th century occult revival. This is probably in the Dictionnaire, page 8. So again, it's plenty of sources that you can check regarding the foundation. Takes this as a modern layer of something much deeper and older and original and primigenial. there is no doubt that the texts provide ample clarity. For once, at least some modern aspects that are at least explicitly, calmingly clear about the soul. And so one might well wonder how those who sort of at least mischaracterize, other than sort of just categorically dismissing the entirety of alchemy, some sort of infantile chemistry regarding statements of this nature, right? Again, I've never really talked about alchemy before in these terms, but it's still something that it's worth looking at, in particular as sort of the continuous, the continuous thread and fil rouge that connects, in fact, the primigenial tradition with our own times, almost in de facto, right? Building upon the ternary parallels within the human constitution that we expounded before, it becomes possible to transition to the quaternary parallels, which instead pertain to the elements. So this is also very relevant. So to begin, the influence of the earth elements demands examination. So in order to achieve comprehensive grasp here, it's necessary to revisit also the principles of neutralization of opposing principles that produce the body dimensions of entities, which are actually a bit of a complicated topic. We will see, if anything, in another time. But let's put it in this way. Among its various facets, one opposition involves the universal versus the individual. It's a vectorial matter at the end of the day. And so the universal versus the individual yielding as an opposition, its outcome a cessation of cognition, subsequently characterized as the apprehension of an external material realm. We've seen this again also in other religiously themed videos. Essentially, God is omniscient because he fully enacts his self, and he knows he can therefore project his providence, understood properly, the capacity of predict the future, from Latin provideo, right? So literally means to see beyond, and so to manifest his perenniality, right? And all the rest existing just like a layer, as a reverberation of the same, not as within the higher nature, right? As such, and God just is, right? So in the doctrine of being and becoming, you realize that whoever is not God is basically characterized as all mortal beings, but by some yearning of sort that manifests the fact that there is a dynamism, a battle, in other words, vivere militare, as the Latin said, is as a struggle to, in fact, return to the one or perish, right? And if you go in the opposite direction to God, you will basically increasingly exasperate yourself and dissolve into this, let's say, dependence on something external that is you can't find within yourself, which is but an illusion in that sense, right? Because if it is not God, it is also something that you do not see resonating within yourself, as we've seen here with the alchemic principles of the Holy Trinity. At the end of the day, there's the same identical theology occurs, right? And so you will, at that point, long for mostly a material dimension, which is what today people do. There is no overarching meaning. We start from the assumption that in order to study nature, we should base on what we sort of, again, mechanically or empirically experience, other than starting from the completely opposite point. There is an absolute being, and we are just an accident outside of the same. So we should measure our world not on the basis of its aberration, but in the opposite direction, right? And obviously people are ever more materialistic, because by not finding an answer what they should, they try to compensate this with having sort of kind of more, but they don't know how to achieve that. this actually in line still with seeking the divine. Otherwise, you would at that point simply self-destroy. But it's like, trying to accumulate all a series of pebbles and not being able, of stones, say to say, but not being absolutely able to build a structure with them anymore. So just accumulating wealth per se, not using that as a mean to an end, as also a manifestation of power. And that's in fact why also the poorest people are the most materialistic, and why Marxism in fact is based on this predicament to begin with. Now, the power of salt in this operates within the petrification of the spiritual domain, affected by the physical senses themselves, within the severance of connections and within the rigid adherence to the dualistic principle of I, non-I, a factor we have at times identified as the primary barrier preventing modern individuals from comprehending traditional sciences, right? So the idea that in fact our existence is merely a matter of senses, and not, like in this case, like as a sum of capacity, not as the sort of manifestation of a higher form, the divine. And that's again why the soul, the spirit, and the body are three separated things, and we're not even told that this exists. Actually, we're insistently told, for some even emotional rather than scientific reason, by alleged scientists, that again there's no free will, there's nothing of that kind, there's no soul whatsoever, because we can't see it, and you're just basically an idiot for thinking that. Of course, if you're trying to to demonstrate the existence of the soul in a laboratory through, again, an empirical and material observation, well, it's a bit difficult to get there. But of course, if you decide that all what matters only stems from there, well, you've already signed your death sentence. Within the specific hermetic symbolic framework under review, salt, body, stone, and earth are interchangeable. So this is the last element. So what characterizes humanity more than much? Practically, this equates to the dominance of earth with the nigredo, so the blackness, the darkness, or in fact leaden state of lead, which is in fact why the lead, because of course it was understood very well also very early on that it had an incredibly high specific weight, and so its subatomic structure was in this sense ever more distant from transcendence, because it was overloaded in protons. Whereas if you look at hydrogen, like there is a reason where before we were talking about boiling water, and also oxygen as the food for life, which is obviously not a coincidence if you look at the primordial broth from which we should have emerged. And so that's where you understand that actually science, if framed in a much bigger picture, makes actually a lot of sense. It's telling us pretty straightforwardly what this is all about. Also from times where people did not really have the same, in fact, chemical knowledge of the last couple of 100 years, right? And they had already sorted out some of the deeper meanings of the same. This dominance of earth with the nigredo leaden state of the base metals in the magnum opus, the unregenerate, opaque, and Saturnian condition of human consciousness, wherein the soul is buried, sepultus in corpore, literally buried in the body, and perception is bound to sensory duality, equanimity, and succession. Now, what is incredibly interesting about this is that, as we've seen in the videos also about the Indo-European heaven and the role of Saturn, also in the video about the slumbering monarchs in the German folklore, what does the sleeping mountain tells you? What does the transcendence of the same tells you in a actually global sense, like also in fact geographical sense? It is exactly this condition. In that case, it mostly, like especially in the mountain, sleeping mountains, it's about the fact that there is a somatic dimension that, as we've seen, remains in the nether world, whereas the soul of the emperors in particular will have achieved something in the firmament as an actual sanctity. There are actual, saint rulers. France has a hell of a tradition in that regard, and they were the same ones who thought to sleep in the Mount of Jupiter, which is exactly Montjoie, Saint-Denis. Therefore, this idea of being asleep, right, obnubilated by the torpor of sin, buried in your own body, right, because you're dependent on your senses and you're not able to awaken, and so you're slumbering in the mountain yourself, is all there. I mean, what can I tell you? It's literally the same meaning. This is the black earth, the terra nigra of the alchemists, the caput mortuum, or dead head remaining after calcination, symbolizing the ego isolated in its self-referential illusion. That's why the philosophers, by the way, like in this also different paintings of the year, have the skull in their hand, right? And the mocking of vanity stays in this very, in fact, dead element at the end of it all, right? There are deeper meanings. I can think even about vampirism and what that actually means in a Titanic notion, and of the undead, right? Of that, however, is destined, however, to remain dependent on the literally on the dirt, on the earth where he had died and sort of resurrected, so to say, from this dead, never actually living it. It's rather the undead than an actual living, right? So there is an enormous set of also common folklore. At this point we are actually losing great part of that memory, but that are incredibly explicit about this whole. The operative antidote to the terra nigra is, and I would like, by the way, to suggest last week's video about the Deva-Asura struggle in Vedic, literally metaphysical geography, where the land of the south, where the dead lives, is the darkness, as opposed to the sacred fire of the north. It's all there in the Indo-European theology, by the way. And there, in fact, there is a veritable antidote. There are some rites to perform, etc. And in alchemy, the operative antidote is the repeated application of solve et coagula. That is to say, dissolution of the fixed, salt/body, into the volatile, that is Mercury, the spirit, followed by recoagulation under the directive of the awakened sulphur, the soul fire. This is incredibly important because you have a dead substance that gets revivified by the Holy Ghost, the divine's grace, and remolded in its divine form by the purifying fire, principle that has completely transcended it. All right. Through this rhythmic alternation, the subtler elements, water, which stands in this sense as in the baptism for purification, because it's the holy water, by the way, in and of itself. It's actually the most chthonic, well, also the earth. It depends on really what to look at, because something varied from tradition to alchemy, and we'll talk about this too. But water, you see, is intended here as holy water, and so it's something transfigured already. It's the maternal womb that is being gravitated by the Godfather. And so, as such, is holy, just like the Virgin. The air is the sublimation, as we've seen before with probably the vapors, right, of heat, of grace that manifests through thunder, like in Agni. And in fact, the fire that in fact lights it up in the process itself, that is the illumination. And these are progressively liberated from their terrestrial matrix in this way. It's how resurrection actually happens, by the way, in the end time. Transmuting the leaden, the nigredo, so this dark consciousness into, because there is still life in it, right? The fact that this leaden matter exists, as we've seen also in Mithras myth, is that it can't be transfigured in something else, because it contains, after all, that little grain of being that allows to come back to the one. In fact, transmuting this leaden conscientiousness into the gold of non-dual participatory awareness. Non-dual participatory means literally that there are not two distinguished natures, but only one, because the lower one has partaken divinity at this point. Through also awareness, meaning a providential achievement through work, so a willing and not random accomplishment of he who has risen to God. Thus, earth is not merely a physical element, but the ontological condition of exile. This is extremely, extremely relevant. That's literally how Adam and Eve are, in that they literally fell from heaven, and as such, they were to live on an earth that represents to them a metaphysical exile. Its transcendence is the prerequisite for ascent through the planetary spheres and reunion with the quintessentia that we will see better in another video. And this is something very famous, also found, I don't know, in Dante's cosmology. It's all there. Again, our culture, our higher culture is macroscopically and explicitly replete with this information. But how often have you actually been told anything about this? Thus, the influence of earth upon man consists of that force which, via the body, imposes upon him a physical perspective of the world. You can also check another work if you're interested, the one of Robert Flood, 1774-1637. He was an English Paracelsian physician, cosmologist, and Rosicrucian apologist from Beerstead, Kent, son of a royal treasurer who studied at Oxford and traveled Europe, authoring illustrated works on macrocosm, microcosm, harmony blending, Kabbalah, alchemy, and Neoplatonism. In particular, his work Utriusque Cosmi Historia, so it would be the doctrine of the two natures, so the history of the two cosmos, that again sounds Gnostic but is not Gnostic. Aside from all the issues, again, that could derive from the theological misinterpretation, also Christian confession at the time, doesn't matter. This was published in Oppenheim in 1619, right? And in this work, that's why I cited, Earth is depicted therein as the focal point of the perceivable universe. That's also where the geocentric view stems from. It's not much of a cosmical matter within, I don't know, the solar system. It's something way higher, metaphorical. That is, we literally start from this, right? From this sort of lower scale dimension. That is, if you look at it, not just cosmologically, but individually, our body, the Earth, in which we seem sort of to be trapped in. And we yearn for something greater, something absolute, something universal, as a matter of fact. That's why Earth in this work, among others, by the way, is depicted as the focal point of the perceptible universe, aligning correspondingly with the 5 human senses that form the foundation of sensory experience. That are just essentially the fractal consequence of incarnation, because these senses would be all one in a perfect being. And they are not even technically the mechanical functions that we're told they are. There's just like since we're little, they're the product of something else. And if anything, they're an aberration in the measure in which, as humans, we sort of came to incarnate like this, because this is obviously always wanted by us as such in an imperfect way, as we sin and we are against ourselves. So blind to the power that we are actually subconsciously denying to ourselves. It's also worth noting that in a manuscript dated to the 1300s, ascribed to Ortolanus, there was a medieval alchemist of obscure identity, possibly from a coastal quote-unquote garden region, renowned solely for his influential commentary on the emerald tablet that popularized alchemical interpretation in Europe. The terra, the earth figure, arises from the mutual neutralization of two directional forces within the emblem of Solomon's seal. right? There are many contemporary figures, by the way, you could check out when we talk about alchemy, because in a sense, like sort of same chemists, thermochemists, politicians of, I don't know, like pretty famous people at some point in the 19th, the early 20th century were very much into this stuff, right? And they actively researched, like the actual establishment elite of at least a few generations ago. Doesn't matter how post-traditional in a sense that really was, but somewhat, of course, maintained very high standards also in post-traditional times. They were very well aware of this. So we will talk about also many more authors that studied this stuff at some point. Because, again, scholarship is important, as long as you realize which scholarship as well. Now, a critical insight emerges from the wall we just looked at. The elements surpassing Earth, namely air, water, and fire, in their intrinsic essence remain unknown to the average person. This may seem strange, but this is the level of slumber we really are collectively. It's not like we're not aware of them. Like, we perceive them as they adapt to sensibility when manifesting through the earth element, so ourselves. In other words, as they also convert into the work of bodily perception. You could say it's a mechanic process, but it's not quite purely that, because again, we all have in potential, and therefore to some degree of awareness, like this of consciousness, their action vividly going. The water, air, and fire, familiar to all, that is, as physical states of matter, serve merely as palpably symbolic analogs of the authentic elements that are obviously metaphysical. Again, there is no hypostatic separation. There is always a component of this in all of reality. Just it's our own subjectivity that prevents us to fully understand the extent of them. And so, of course, there are people who are more or less gifted in this regard, but more importantly, that can easily work in that regard and say the human average is pretty terrible, and even the most gifted elements naturally at this point in history have a great difficulty in fully awakening, which is also like the big question here. We talk about tradition, but can tradition be re-achieved in 2025? I mean, do we even have the metaphysical preconditions, like in our essence, to our degenerated stage of humanity, to have any minimal awareness? Because, okay, I don't want to ramble again, but today's notions are mostly and seemingly gnostic appeals to, you know, you have to be self-aware, and, or, I don't know, you have to awaken. I guess these politicians, they're lying to you. There is this conspiracy theory. And nobody does anything minimal to augment themselves at any metaphysical level, or achieves that to begin with. Of course, everybody does to a minimal degree, but is this enough to even set our minds on a collective, conventional vocabulary of this stuff? Like, do we even understand what we're talking about? No, right? I'm sure that very few people will be even able to understand what I'm talking about, not, of course, even getting where this old knowledge is supposed to lead you. And this is, in fact, the collective problem we're talking about. The elements, the authentic elements, the Hermetic masters term living, and which in their own right represent distinct existential states and alternative modes of consciousness unbound by the body, that can be achieved. And within each of these, every principle of reality can be transformed by analogy, just as within the condition of bodily existence in a terrestrial form, all principles are transposed and recognized through their manifestations within the domain of the earth element. That's why fire was sacred, for example, to the Indo-Europeans. So how this is not really a mystery. Why is that? Right, we'll learn it better looking at probably the etymology. We've seen partly the etymology of fire, but also it's the one of its manifestation, how this entwines with the the cosmos, or even just through literally the vocabulary, and saying how did we come to name our world, the things within it, and what kind of connection is in there, because literally our language is based on this. And also, you likely don't know this. You've been told your language is just some sort of convention, right? It could have been something else. No, the words that we use, etymologically speaking, have an absolute value in a universal dimension. They're not peregrine, they're not random, all right? And if you know the etymology of your own words, if you use them correctly, you can achieve veritable power. In its broadest connotation, this constitutes the terrestriality of the metals, meaning the individualized principles that, in this sense, can also be, for Earth, like occasionally labeled as well as impurity, dross, or shadow, but that are termed properly by the alchemists, like to describe what pertains to the Earth. As for the remaining elements beyond Earth, which collectively form the heaven of the philosophers, were with the premise that what is visible is a reflection of what is invisible, the symbolic Earth is constructed as the visible portion of heaven, equivalent to the visibility of the invisible. In other words, what we actually perceive in a lower sense is in and of itself part of the higher dimension. That the wonder of nature, of life, of beauty is inherently carrying the seed of the higher nature. And that's why there is no hypostatic separation between the two. That's why every day you should really marvel at what life is, right? It's not simply a philosophy just to say, well, cheer up, try to see the positive. You should actually be able to acknowledge that what you have right now is beyond already by itself to the finite dimension that you can witness to. Imagine if this simply increased. And there are ways to empirically measure this in life, meaning think about knowledge itself, or think about how more powerful and confident and resolute, determined you are when you actually know something. If we treat everybody's opinions as equal, if we start presuming that there is some sort of further sheltering that we have to give people, we are just burying them even more in their own body. Don't confuse, by the way, this with Gnostic heresies, because as we explained them before, they speak the same trajectory, but the opposite direction. It's like transgenderism. It's not like these people are breaking free from the body. They are actually slaves of their own sensorial, emotionalistic, like fragility in the sense humanity. Remember always that humus means dirt, and so that's what actually human means. That's also why they think that just changing a part of the body makes them something that they are not, right? They're completely oblivious of any kind of metaphysical reality that eventually lives in people, and that they go in the opposite direction of destroy themselves in the process. Earth, thus, as the material principle of everything that exists, seems a right definition, encompassing the physical condition of the other elements beyond Earth. Access to the elements requires a mode of cognition distinct from what derived from the body at the same time. This is, again, necessary because it is, again, the point, the metaphysical status in which we are. But you must operate with these other spheres, so to say, which is a bit the same concept as we've seen that initially we traced with body, spirit, and soul in order of ascendancy. Regardless also of the enhancement through every technique of modern scientific experimentation, I mean, you can't simply stimulate this from a merely material point of view. I mean, there are ways to facilitate the path, but that only happens because of a conscious spiritual decision, an act of will. The governing tenet of this alternative cognition is that like is known by means of like. Therefore, it's only by exposing yourself to these increasingly unreachable elements that you can sort of understand the enormity of it all. and the truth behind them. This underlying assumption is reiterated in alchemic texts. It's the core essence of man, encompassing the essences of these additional elements as well, signifying the potential for further states of consciousness apart from the one enchanted by earth, which is just the most immediate, the most, again, bodily familiar sort of individual. So what are we looking at in conclusion? I think it is clear, like what is important about this work is that we're going to naturally make, hopefully, of course, you may never know, a lot of all of this at some point that will add up, right? And will expound, again, this broader doctrinal body in ways that definitely in the first video you can't immediately see, right? But this will be remembered a bit as a historical video. But it's important to recapitulate a little, at least contextually, regarding the aforementioned quaternary ascent, precisely mirroring the 4 classical stages, in fact, of the magnum opus, the great work. As, if anything, here we're talking psychological terms. I mean, you're watching a YouTube channel to a degree you can't relate. As an initiatory statement, so to say. Then you have, again, the Nigredo. This is very famous, by the way. It is to be found in many, like in all the alchemic symbols. The Nigredo, which is properly the darkness. Earth/salt, right? Corresponding to mortification, confrontation with the shadow, which is death, obviously. Still, descent into the unconscious, and symbolized by putrefaction and the black sun. Then you have the albedo, which is the whiteness that is proper of water/Mercury, pertaining to purification, lunar rebirth, so the rise of the crescent, the washing away of the impurities, the ablutio, yielding the white stone, the opal, which is in fact the moonstone as well, especially in the Cancer, if you're aware also astrological and astronomical connections there, which has to do with intuitive clarity, by the way. And it is, in fact, this first stage of elevation, and that's exactly what baptism gives you. And when you, in fact, participate to the rites, you're perfectly aware of how this thing actually mounts in your soul. Why going to church? Why is this all? Why do we talk about Catholicism? Why do we talk about tradition? None of this is merely anecdotal. None of this is merely like, oh, well, like just an opinion. This guy, I don't know, maybe he was brought up like this. You have no idea of my background. It's something that, well, it's nothing shocking at all. Actually, nothing even unusual. But it's not something that you may deduce simply from, oh, this guy is referring to this or that just because, you know, he had something, in fact, unusually told, when it was absolutely not. I came to this all by myself, by the way, and that's also, I think, a pretty good sign, especially from a sort of solid, I must say, background. I was very lucky in my life, but in many ways, and in the same, in fact, ways, I could do this by myself. And so this is the proof that you can do it too. We can all do much more. Then you have the citrinitas, corresponding to yellow, just like the citrus, the lemon, corresponding to the air/sulphur. Sulphur that is yellow, of course. Corresponding to illumination, the awakening of the intellectual vision, the intellectus, the yellowing of the soul under solar influence. Right? This is an incredibly important stage in somebody's life, because this is really biographical, where you can relate to this. You can relate to being and not being. You can relate to the lower chthonic dimension of yourself, your bodily limits, and then you know that there is something that really that helps you. Even again in the water, in the motherly element that arises you, that gives you, some dignity in the initiation. And then you grow up, and then you start learning things, and so you're exposed essentially to tradition, to wisdom, and at that point you must react in a way that is conducive to the rubedo, the red, the symbol again of the sun, of Ra. This is to be found really everywhere in the symbols of power, of divinity. We've seen them all across sort of universal tradition, corresponding to, in fact, the fire and soul. The Sol Invictus is exactly red, right? There are many connections, probably this color, and those beings that lead to this. In the visit, again, about sacred royalty, it's plenty of this. And also what the purple is exactly the symbol of divinity. In fact, meaning unification, the fixation of the volatile into the incorruptible red stone. It's the sacred commitment, is the holy communion, right? The birth of the homo novus, or philosophic man capable of perceiving and acting from the center of being. Each stage corresponds to a dominant element, a planetary regime, a mode of consciousness, and a phase of inner transmutation. The entire process is not chemical, but chemical, meaning there's a sacred science of resurrection wherein the adept, by inwardly enacting the cosmic drama, redeems not only himself, but the fallen world, the Kun Olam. And this is the most foundational Catholic principle, as a matter of fact. This is what the sacrifice of God in order to be divine really means. It's present in all religions. You have still the celebrated people who says, oh no, Odin hanging himself has nothing to do with Christ being crucified. It's the same identical thing. Like, if you're unaware of this, it's because you literally have zero knowledge about all of this. You just treat these religions as some sort of standalone things with nothing in between, because you're obsessed about your post-traditional lesser people, fourth estate subculture, and you yearn, in fact, for something that is outside of divinity, because you're just hating yourself and leading to disaster. In the same way, this is the actual way to it, right? It naturally requires for you to be a dignified human being, which is very hard to find nowadays, and that's true. It's through this path, in this manner, that we arrive at the quaternary partitioning of man's complete integral being. And that's something, again, we will definitely investigate more as we continue our journey into hermetics and the a great part of what really corresponds to our more habitual traditional religious channeling, the way it was understood. As you understand, in a metaphorical sense, essentially. I personally find ancient religion much more interesting because the sources are much more directly explicit about what happens, and that's how I form myself as well at large. But alchemy is a very interesting branch in as much as it shows exactly how this knowledge was incredibly alive up to literally the last century, right? Literally, up to the last century, actually educated people, aristocrats, the elite, etc., knew about this stuff, and at least some of them, because they were better people, right? They knew better, and they had power exactly because they followed these principles that had been passed down generation from generation to generation across the ages, and it was known all across the estates, as a matter of fact. The church was aware of that, the nobility was aware of this, the third estate was aware of this, like a fourth estate a bit less, to say the least, and at the end of the day, being jealous of this to the point of also bringing to the wild animal force, like trying to destroy everything, so to put an end to their own misery simply because they're too weak to understand what they have to actually achieve. And great part of our today's quote-unquote culture, which is actually subculture, post-traditional terms, is all impregnated with, and it is horrifying, really. Like, literally smells of negrade, of putrefaction. But the gates of hell shall not prevail against her. Right? And I will actually, again, talk more about this because it's really definitive as beautiful, and I really believe that we can find an enormously large amount of work and knowledge and commitment in this stuff. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.